Good morning, it's Tuesday the 9th of December, and today we're going to be looking at building web front ends using the latest web standards. So if you were here yesterday, we did a talk on, me and Martin Kern did a talk on building sites with ASP.NET, Visual Studio and Azure. And it's been a really busy week for us here at Microsoft Developer Experience because we're delivering a webinar every lunchtime and it's on a different topic. We'd love it if you joined again tomorrow to hear my partner in crime, Martin Kern, talk about API services for web and devices, or perhaps on Thursday for a SignalR talk, or from me again on Friday. Oh, sorry, actually, it's me Thursday on SignalR, and then on Friday, Martin Kern will cover running and maintaining sites in the real world. If you do like these webinars and you'd like us to do more, please tweet us at the Beebs for myself, or it's at Martin Kern for Martin Kern, or email me over at martin.bb@microsoft.com. We can use those tweets and emails to influence our boss that we should do more of these kinds of webinars, so please help us and spread the word. If you hate the session we're doing this week, or the sessions that we're doing this week, also let us know, but perhaps do that on email rather than Twitter, just so that I can keep my job. So today I'm going to be covering three areas. First, we're going to talk a little bit about web standards that allow us to build the modern web. Then I'll cover a few JavaScript frameworks, and then finally we will dive a little deeper into EMBER.JS, and I'll show a little demo of an EMBER.JS app. So I hope you're getting the full beauty of this next origami transition. There you go, look at that. It flies away. So consumers have really high expectations of software these days. If a website doesn't load in a few seconds, they'll go elsewhere. And if a site doesn't work first time, they'll go elsewhere. And in many instances, apps, I think, are kind of providing a better experience than their website counterparts. They're satisfying a need and delivering a beautiful experience with like touch and gesture support. They work offline, they work on mobile devices. And if you place a web app that's been built maybe a year or so ago and compare that to an app, well, the app often wins. But the web can be magical. And much of that magic comes from HTML5, it's JavaScript and CSS. The combination of web standards such as HTML5 and CSS can result in beautiful, solid, easy to maintain websites that can rival applications. But the challenge is, for a developer, we have to learn this stuff, and it's not always easy to do that. There's lots that you have to do to sort of to skill up, I guess. But if you do take advantage of these new capabilities in browsers, then you can deliver sites that can meet users' high expectations. HTML5 just isn't another marketing term like Web 2.0. It's a standard that allows browser vendors to know what to implement. So it's set up by a standards body, and then the browser vendors, be that Google, be that Chrome, be that Microsoft, go ahead with that standard and implement that. And because all browser vendors are implementing it, it means that it's available on practically all modern devices, from PC desktops to tablets to mobiles to smartwatches to TVs to games consoles. But when people say HTML5, they often mean HTML5, JavaScript, CSS3, and all the related specifications. They sort of use it as an umbrella term. They sort of use it as an umbrella term, I guess. And whilst that might annoy some developers who want to be very specific about the fact that HTML5 is a single specification, we should call it that thing. In the greater world, no one really cares, because, and I think we should cut everyone else a break. They should be allowed to call modern web specification HTML5, and that should be a fine thing, because all of that, it's more important that the world has sort of confidence in moving to these standards rather than getting distracted by sort of infighting over semantics about the way that we use words. So why should you care? Well, browsers have become really powerful, and we can use some of these new capabilities to give our websites an edge. And because we're building to standards, our content will more or less work anywhere. Now, not all browsers are equal, of course, but rather than using code that detects the browser and then serves code for that specific browser like a technique called browser sniffing, we can use feature detection to determine if a browser supports a specific feature, and then either use that feature, or if the browser doesn't support it, we can fall back to something more sort of old school or solid maybe. So for example, we can use a library like Modernizer, which we'll look at later, or write our own test and determine if a browser supports, say, HTML5 audio, and if it does, we can use that, and if it doesn't, we can fall back to Flash or something similar. So this is a website called Photosynth, and it's an example of something you can do imaginatively in HTML5. It has beautiful touch controls, so I can swipe and move and gesture around and navigate this application. Photosynth is a way of users are able to upload these sort of 3D visual photo experiences that they create with their mobile devices, and you can explore it. This isn't a video. This is an interactive HTML5 canvas, and we're able to go back and forth zoom in to the different areas and elements. And if you've ever used or seen Photosynth before, it's quite an amazing kind of technology, which on the mobile device, it stitches together all of these photos and allows it to be consumed and viewed in this sort of way. It's another example of some northern lights, another example of a building, these are multiple photos stitched together, not a video of this, which we can explore from different angles and so forth. So you can see this rather scary face as we go under and see a bit of an evil nose there. Or we can build more complex things, not just beautiful things or interesting things like this. We could build things like this Visual Studio, online Visual Studio application that we can it's an IDE basically in a browser. So if you go to any website inside of Azure and you switch on Edit in Visual Studio Online and you save that thing, then we can go to the dashboard up here, and then scan down to the right-hand side. In a moment, the Edit in Visual Studio is now available, and we can edit that website live in an IDE written entirely in JavaScript using HTML5 features to enable this. So if you can build an IDE in JavaScript and HTML5, then pretty much you can build any kind of line of business application or application practically. You can even edit JavaScript and CSS. It has IntelliSense support. It understands brackets. All of that whole editor is built using JavaScript. It's pretty amazing, really. I'm glad it's not my job because that would have been hard. But yeah, it supports snippets. It's a fully blown IDE directly in the browser. So when it comes to web standards, there are really two standard bodies that count. We've got the W3C and ECMA. W3C look after HTML, CSS, web apps, SVG, geolocation, to name a few of them, and ECMA look after JavaScript. When you're working with modern standards, there's going to be a few websites that can help. So here are a few of my favorites. The first being one which we develop ourselves. It's called modern.ie. And modern.ie allows you to do things, well, a few things, but the thing that I like most is the scanning functionality. So I can scan or enter my URL of my website, and it will do a full scan of that website, and it will tell me if we have what kind of support we have for modern web standards and how we can improve. So for example, in this report that you got on screen there, we're told that we're using CSS prefixes in our code, and when you click on that CSS prefix, it gives you information about the problem the scanner found and instructions on how to fix it. So it actually even takes you to the line of code. If you click on that blue box there, it'll take you to the line of code which is causing the problem in your CSS. Another great website which I use all the time is Can I Use. Can I Use allows us to search for specifications, and it gives us a table of browser support for that feature. So in this instance, it shows that the audio element isn't supported by IE8, but has broad support everywhere else. And this information makes it easier to understand if you're able to use a certain HTML5 feature or not. And you can compare this data with the analytics information you might have about your users and the browsers that you need to support on your site. In some ways, it's very similar to the feature which is provided by the Visual Studio Editor using the new Web Essentials plugin. So for CSS, as you type a CSS property, IntelliSense shows you the browser support. So with box shadow here, we can see it's supported in Chrome, Firefox 9, and IE9 and above. IE9 and above. I can't say IE right today. I don't know why. And all versions of, or some versions of Opera and Safari. Another great tool which you'll see an awful lot of in this modern front-end world is Modernizer. Modernizer is a JavaScript library that makes it easy to test if a browser supports a particular feature or not. So I talked about feature detection earlier, this idea of testing if a browser is capable of doing something, rather than testing for browsers or different browsers. So here you can see some code that tests if a browser supports CSS transforms. If it does, then it will use them. And if the browser doesn't, it will try and use a fallback. And in this instance, I'm using a rather poor fallback, but i.e. filters to do CSS transforms. So next, Bootstrap. This is a CSS framework which is used a hell of a lot in modern front ends. Bootstrap is included in all ASP.NET MVC apps and allows you to easily build responsive sites. Rather than using monolithic sort of CSS classes, Bootstrap allows us to use small classes that are composed to achieve the desired layout and design effects. This architectural choice of using a single responsibility principle is the way that it's the power, the essence of why Bootstrap is so useful. And I'll explain a little bit more in a few moments. When you create a new project, NuGet automatically adds the files to your project. CSS is used and does the bulk of what Bootstrap is famous for, but there's also a JavaScript library that NuGet includes as well. But I think that that's only required if you want to use some of the Bootstrap widget. So here you can see the files that NuGet adds for you. And then there's this Bootstrap on a mobile device. So here's a web app using Bootstrap in full screen inside of IE on Windows 8. And if I dock a game next to this site like this, then you can see how the orientation of the website has changed to work better in that smaller viewport. This also allows your site to look good on a mobile phone, because that's kind of the view that it will take on a mobile phone as well. So let's see how Bootstrap is added to a brand new MVC site inside of Visual Studio. So here I'm inside Visual Studio. Take a demo basic Bootstrap file. Create that new web application. Choose empty or MVC. Click OK. And you'll see that it's saying creating project. It's adding Bootstrap. It's adding jQuery. This is using that NuGet stuff inside of Visual Studio. It's adding another number of different files. Respond.js is another one, another JavaScript file that's adding to the base template. Asking us if we want to do source control. We'll just cancel that for the moment. And we can see that Bootstrap's been added into the content folder for us. And also we have some JavaScript files there in the script folder. So if we look inside of the shared layout folder, we'll see that we have styles renderer, and that takes the content for the styles, for the CSS styles, the base files. And then we've got a renderer down here which adds a bundle, the Bootstrap bundle. If you're not familiar with bundles, well, bundles are a way of packaging up content. So in ASP.NET. So here we add, here's the Bootstrap definition of the Bootstrap bundle. We have bootstrap.js and we have respond.js. And there's the CSS file, which is added to that content bundle. And then we've got Bootstrap in the CSS as well. So there's the JS and the content, the CSS Bootstrap files are added using bundles to the default ASP.NET application. And when we start up the application, that is basically a Bootstrap application. So if I remove or if I take out Bootstrap and then run it up in Internet Explorer, you'll see all of the styles have kind of disappeared effectively. So we can see, by comparing the two, that Bootstrap does an awful lot for us in terms of style and layout, and we're doing a lot of that inside of CSS. So there's that Bootstrap page again. So if I just use the F12 tools here and explore the markup a little bit, you'll see that the sort of div elements, if we look back in Visual Studio there, you can see the div elements, they're composed of these very small things like navbar, navbar invert. By changing some of these very small CSS classes, we can completely change the way that the site looks. So we can add those back in, navbar inverse, navbar fixed top. So when we didn't have those added in, the navbar wasn't fixed to the top, and the colors weren't inversed. But now we've added those back in, it is fixed to the top, and the colors are inversed. And we could add those properties to other, not just navbars, and it would take on those properties. So is fixed, for example, would add CSS fixed to fix this thing to a specific position. So Bootstrap does an awful lot. It's composable, and it's made up of these very small CSS classes, which can do really interesting things when composed together to build our application layouts. Now, when we look at Bootstrap, I think there's ways of configuring this, but the default is that it has 12 columns, and it's a 12-column grid. Oops, excuse me. So what I mean by that, if we go out into one of our files, layout.html, you'll see that we're rendering a portion of that content inside of the container div we're calling render body, which is going to render the content which is passed into this template. So if I go into something which uses that template, such as home, basically everything in that rendered body is going to be rendered, everything in this file is going to be rendered in that rendered body. So we've got a jumbotron there, and then we've got what says a row, and then it says, oh sorry, let's just take that container out for a moment and run this up. So because we've taken the container out, you'll see that the site has gone like full screen, or the width of it has gone full screen. So that you can see that that container element, that container tag that we've added, that actually has some kind of effect on the page. You can see it a little bit easier if I zoom out for it, perhaps, that it will just occupy the entire size of the screen. If I undo that and then restart it, that container, and I'm still zoomed out so you can see it more explicitly, but that container restricts the size to say, I think it's 900 pixels or something like that. And then inside of that container, we can then have this grid. And we saw that a little bit in the CSS. So inside of the render body, let's go back there. So we have a row. So a row contains 12 columns effectively, and then we've got a div here, and one's got 4 columns, so that's going to occupy 4 columns of space. That next one's going to occupy another 4 columns of space, and this is what we're seeing here. This is the result of that. These 4 by so 12 by divided by 4 is 3, so it gives us 3 columns. You can make changes here. You can create more than one row, for example, and that would show up as we did a minute ago. We can remove one. Obviously, when we remove one, it just removes out of the way. Now, it's important to remember, if we go into mobile view, this site's going to, they might not be stacked vertically, they might stack horizontally, they might stack vertically. We can change that now to occupy, say, 2 columns, and this one to occupy 10. And then we go to by 10. So we can position things not by pixel size, but by how many spaces it takes in a column. And there's also other kinds of features like offsets and other things inside of here as well, which we could use. So if I had another one called column D offset 4, what that does, it's going to take occupy 4 spaces, but it's going to be offset by 4, so it kind of leaves a gap. It misses 4, and then it goes into the next one. All of this is composed using CSS, and all of this layout's achieved using CSS, but it's kind of Bootstrap's ability to compose these styles, which makes it easier to generate applications which work really well across lots of different kinds of devices. And so if we take this website and we move back to, say, modern IE, we can use IE to take screenshots for us to see how that Bootstrap site looks in multiple browsers on multiple devices. So this is modern IE. I've put the URL of that website into that site. I've done a scan, and it's generated a number of different images for me of how the site looks on different devices. So if I go and click on the iPhone image, we can see how it looks on an iPhone. So there's the iPhone image, and you'll see that the site's orientated more like a mobile application. There's the hamburger menu, and the content now just looks more mobile friendly. And we can also click on the iPad view. And again, now the site shows, and we can see it's correctly optimized for the tablet. So this is responsive web development, and it makes it easy for us to build applications which look great across mobile, across desktop, and across tablet. So let's take a look at sort of JavaScript libraries that you might be using in modern front-end development. So this is jQuery. Actually, this is the actor jQuery rather than the JavaScript framework. But I promise you that now you've heard jQuery said like that, you'll never be able to hear jQuery the same ever again. So this is the actual jQuery framework, and lots of people use jQuery. It's one of the first open source frameworks that the ASP.NET team added to their templates for .NET back in the day, and it was just purely because of its popularity. It's currently used by over 59 million sites, and 66.2% of the top 10,000 websites use it, which is pretty amazing. It's so popular in my opinion because, well, it's easy to learn, there are lots of plugins, and it's easier for element selection, and about a million times easier than remember in document.getElementID and get element by classes and all of that other syntax. It's small, it's lightweight, but the key is that the community has really built up and embraced it, built up around it and embraced this framework. And you see you're able to go to jQuery.com for downloading. There's documentation, which is great. There's whole forums on there where you can discuss it, and Stack Overflow has just tons of information about jQuery. And if you've been in web development for any time, you'll know all of this, obviously. There's communities and meetups. There's the option to extend it with plugins, and there are plugins for practically every requirement. And there's also frameworks like JQUERY-WHY, which is an okay kind of widgets and effects library for jQuery, an optional one that you could use if you wished. So I think jQuery is important, and the reason I mention it is because it's really the root of the single-page application revolution. But what do I mean when I say single-page applications? Well, I'm talking about there was a way at one time when we were doing web, when really the only way that you did it was there was a client browser, and it made a request to a URL to a web server, and then that web server responded with the full page, the HTML, the CSS, the images, the everything. And we make another request to product 6 of that website, and it would respond with the exact same payload, HTML, CSS, images, and JavaScript, even if there were duplication, even if that things had already downloaded previously. So the payload is much harder or higher in this kind of architecture. Well, with a single page application, of course, the request happens exactly the same, and often the URLs are identical to existing regular websites. And the first time this runs, it's of course going to have to pass down the full HTML, the CSS, the images, and all the JavaScript. But on subsequent loads, if we perhaps browse to another product, rather than downloading all of the images, we might only take down a very small proportion of the data required to construct the page. So it might just be the product information about product number 6, that tiny piece of data, which may only be a JSON piece of information, for example. And it means that we can create much more efficient web pages, which are passing far less between the client and the web server. And what that will result in is a far more responsive look and feel of an application. And it's really how regular applications work versus websites. If you're building an iPhone application, you wouldn't reload the UI every time you went and got some new data. You bind the data to the UI, and that's really what a single page application in the web is doing. It's taking an application kind of architecture and applying it to the web. And there are lots of different techniques and frameworks to do this. So prior to joining Microsoft, I worked for a large online retailer, so I know all about firsthand how difficult it is to produce a good shopping cart. It's really complicated UI. As a user updates a quantity in that little cart, or deletes an item, or changes a delivery option, it's important to update the subtotals, the tax, the shipping instructions, and all the related information with that. And it's critical that experience reacts really quickly, and if nothing gets in the way of, and nothing should ever get in the way of making a purchase or blocking the user from checking out. Even when creating a really simple shopping cart or any kind of UI like that, it's easy to end up with a bug-ridden mess, a mess of JavaScript on-change events. And Knockout is a great way of rising to challenges and UI challenges like this, and it removes all of the complication of creating HTML that needs to respond to changes in the underlying data source. Knockout.js is a library that brings the MVVM pattern to your HTML application. So if you've ever done any WPF or Silverlight, you're probably more than familiar with model, view, view, model, and that pattern. But it's a separation of concerns, a way of separating the UI, which is the display of the data, and the data. So when the data changes, the UI reflects that automatically. So its key features are declarative binding. The HTML is attached to the model we create using some HTML attributes. The specific one it uses is called data bind. This attribute was formally added to the HTML5 specification, but it should work across all browsers, even IE6. It's just an attribute which we add in there, and the specification says we're allowed to put stuff in there. And that gives us information, or gives the Knockout.js engine information about how to bind data to the HTML. The UI updates automatically. So when the model changes, all of the bound objects will automatically update. All of the items that you've bound using data-bind attribute will change in real time as other elements on the model are changed or recalculated. So when you change the quantity of an item, the subtotal will be updated, but also any calculations based upon subtotal will change as well. Knockout also has dependency tracking. It's easy to set up relationships between different properties on the model, so that subtotal then can sort of be a combination of each of the different items multiplied by the quantity, for example. And lastly, it uses templating, so the UI is generated for each item in a list or in a shopping cart. The syntax is very much like a for loop in JavaScript, and the added benefit is that items that are templated in this way are still able to be automatically refreshed when the model changes. So lists can be based upon a model of lists or an array in JavaScript. AngularJS is an open source web application framework, and it's maintained by Google and obviously the community that supports it. And it's similar to Knockout in that it's a way of developing single page applications where you benefit from things automatically updating, and there's a sort of separation of concerns. But in its execution, it's entirely different from Knockout. Its goal is to simplify both development and testing of applications, and by providing a framework for client-side MVC more specifically. So whereas Knockout is MVVM, Angular is trying to take an MVC kind of approach, a client-side MVC, not to be confused with MVC and ASP.NET. It's a different thing. So AngularJS directives, they call them directives, and they allow the developer to specify custom and reusable HTML-like elements and attributes that define data bindings and the behavior of presentation behavior of the presentation of those UI controls. So in the HTML5 tag of the application, you'll see that there is this ng-app attribute that declares the root element of the AngularJS application, under which directives or Angular directives can be used to declare bindings and define behavior. Again, like Knockout, you're able to set up two-way binding, so changes are automatically reflected in the UI. Umbraco is a popular ASP.NET content management system that uses Angular throughout all its latest release, which is notable really because they used to use Knockout. So a lot of developers are kind of, this is flavor of the month, I think, AngularJS in terms of client-side frameworks. For me, it's a little bit, I don't know what the word is, but it's kind of slightly restrictive in many ways because it's kind of an all or nothing approach, or it seems to be when I use it. I should imagine this would work. AngularJS would be really good on a greenfield project, but it would be quite a difficult thing to just kind of implement. Or maybe I'm completely wrong here, but it strikes me as being quite difficult to just implement slowly into a page to do certain things. But I could be completely wrong with that belief. I've never really used AngularJS in much kind of production setting. But I have used what we're looking at next, which is EMBER.JS. And it's, again, another JavaScript framework. There are a lot of them for doing client-side MVC this time. And in my opinion, it's slightly easier to integrate Ember into an existing app than something like Angular. It's just a bit more strict about how it's used, Angular. So we'll take a look at Ember a little bit later in a demo. Now, there are others. There's lots of MVC, MVP, MVVM kind of client-side frameworks. And frankly, it's a bit of a kind of, which way do I turn? Which one should I use? And really, that depends on the project. There is, however, a really great project on GitHub called To Do MVC. And this project implements the same to-do application. So like a non-trivial, but kind of basic application, like a to-do application. So you can list items that you need to do in the future and then mark them off when they've been completed. And it implements this application in multiple MVC, MVVM, MVP, JavaScript client-side frameworks. God, that's a lot of acronyms. And if you're thinking about using a framework, you should probably check out this project because it illustrates in code the various pros and cons of different frameworks. And there are lots of frameworks. It means there's lots of choice. It means that there'll probably be one which suits your new needs and your site's needs. The three that I mentioned there are generally the ones that you'll encounter the most: Ember, Angular, and Knockout. Another one is Backbone, but I don't really know anything about that one, but there's lots of them, as you say. Okay, so now we're going to look at EMBER.JS, a JavaScript single-page application framework, and I'm going to show you how I built a very simple application using this framework. Okay, so I've got this little application here built in EMBER.JS, and it's asked me a question up here, and then there's a number of different responses that I can give. So what's the max memory supported by MS-DOS? I've got no idea. Of course, too high. That's too high. When was the first laser mouse released? I remember seeing one at uni, about 2000. Oh, maybe later. What was Microsoft's first product? Oh gosh, yeah, that's good. What building does not exist on the Microsoft campus? 115. Wow, I don't know. Who wrote the first computer program? Ada Lovelace, wonderful name. Okay, so you get the idea. It asks me a question, I answer it. Now, all of these questions clearly are not on this particular web page. They're not downloaded as some kind of JSON thing. Every time I'll click this button, it will send a response to the server, and when I click next question, it goes and gets a new question and binds it to the page. The beauty of this web application is it works really quick. I can just ram through these different things, and it's very, very, very fast, which is very cool. And it's doing that. It's so fast because I'm sending so little data across the wire. I'm just sending some JSON, which represents the question that I'm being asked. So let's have a look at the code behind this application. So if I go into the index page, we have some references to a thing called handlebars.js and Ember. Handlebars is the templating engine that is used by Ember. We'll see some of that templating just here. Don't worry about it for the moment. But that's it. And these packages, the Ember packages, are managed by NuGet. So if we go into my packages config, we should be able to find an entry for Ember. And there's an entry for handlebars. And because Ember relies on handlebars, that dependency is managed for us by NuGet. So we've just added it there, added Ember, it's added handlebars for us as well. And then we start our application effectively. We have an app. And I think there's a default way of doing it. I think this is the default, the body container, but we're just explicitly saying it. So ember.application create, and it's using body container as the root for our application. So you'll see this div up here, body container. We're using that as the root. And then we use a helper class inside of Ember called object.extend, and it has a title property which says loading question. Some options, which is an empty array, and an answered, whether or not the question's been answered, and this is false at the moment. So we've got effectively app.question, which is kind of a class. Classes don't really exist in JavaScript, but you get what I mean. And then I have app.indexController, and this is the index controller, unsurprisingly, and we're again using a helper function just to extend or create this thing. It has a question property, an answer property, they're both set as null, and an init, and the first thing that this will do is it will call a function called next question. Well, that function is described here, next question, and so this is the first function that's going to be called by the application. So what does it do? Well, it sets a controller as being the index controller. It creates a question, and it creates it for using the app.question.create. And the reason why that create function exists is because we've extended this object. So create exists on that object which we're extending. So we end up with a question. And then once we have the question, we can set the property of the controller, the controller question, to be question. So that's going to set that up. So now our controller exists and it has a question object. So what we're going to do is use JQuery to go and call an API inside of my application, which is the URL API trivia. And what's going to happen is it's going to get a response back from that JSON request, and that response is going to represent a question. And so we're going to go to question.setProperties, and what that does is it binds the JSON data to the question, and it will just use it will make sense of the fact that they're called the same thing, so it's going to be able to set the properties the same. If that fails, it's going to set the question title to oops, something went wrong. So effectively, it calls an API, it gets a question object, that question object is then bound to the controller or set in the controller, and we can use that thing. So if we look at my handlebars template, we have context, and you'll see that this is the view for the index controller. So we have content, we have a container, we have a row. If you've used Bootstrap, you'll know or recognize this syntax. This is Bootstrap syntax. And then we have another row which takes up 12 columns. Again, that's Bootstrap content, and then it's got a thing called a flip container. Now this isn't really important. This is how we add this is how we're adding some of the flip animation that you've seen. When I answered questions, it was flipping in CSS, and what that's doing and the way that it's achieving that is that there was that property on question called answered. Well, if the question is answered, it uses a CSS transform to flip it one way, and if it's not answered, it uses a CSS transform to flip it the other way. So all we're doing is, as the object is answered or it's either not answered or answered, it actually uses that to apply a CSS style to flip the animation. And this is what this bind attribute syntax is doing for us. So this is this handlebars template. So based upon the logic or the state of the object, the state of that question, we will change the way that this answer panel appears, and it'll either flip or not flip. And we'll bind things. So we will bind the answer. If it's been answered, we'll bind the answer, the correct answer, and we'll provide a button which says next question. And as we know, next question is, because of this logic, we've added an action which will go and get the next question when we click that on that button. So this is a way of wiring up that button to our model, which describes how we do, which describes how we do the how we wire up that next question. If the question's not been answered, we have this displayed, which is the question title. Again, we're just binding in the template the default, the question.title property. And then it will go through each of the options, or the question options, which are possible for that question. So for each option in question.options, we're going to add a button. And this is what creates the 4 buttons, the 4 options to the question. And it gives it a button property. This is from Bootstrap, by the way. Button info, which again is a Bootstrap property. And then when that particular button is pressed, it's going to send an answer to the server. So it's going to bind it to the sendAnswer function inside of that controller. And the option option title is going to be set to the text of option.title as well. So this sendAnswer, that's probably going to be inside of the controller. And yes, it is. So when that button's pressed, when you select an answer of one of the 4 possible answers, or there could be more than 4, we could add 5 properties in there, add 5 buttons to our application, but in most instances, well, in all instances in this application, there's only ever 4. And when they click that button, it's going to go and send an answer, and it's going to pass over the question, and it's going to pass over the option that we selected, and it's going to, this makes a reference to the controller. We make a little sort of JavaScript hacky thing to disable all the other buttons so that no one can make double requests or send 2 answers at the same time for the same question to the server. And then we do a jQuery post where we go to the URL APA trivia and we post the question ID and the option ID to that function. And when we get a response, which tells us, is it the correct answer? So yes or no. And depending on that, we set it correct or incorrect. And then controller.set the question.answered true. And then that thing, whether it's been answered or not, is what's going to flip the animation. So that logic, it kind of describes how the model is set up. We then bind our template to that model, and we create, or are able to create, an application which seems to be fun. I think if you were trying to do that from scratch with on-change events in JavaScript and stuff, it would be far more complicated to do that. And that's really the benefit of these single-page applications, is that it's easy to create very complex, highly dependent JavaScript JavaScript UIs with these frameworks. And just to remind you what the site looked like so we can see it in action again, just go to the website. It's going to load the question. Remember, that's the loading question is the default property for that object. So that object does exist there, and then the new object loads in. It binds the title. It creates 4 buttons for us. When I click a button, it sends a request to send answer. It gets whether it's incorrect or not. And then I click next question, which goes to the server, gets a new question, and responds and displays that information. And it's very, very fast because the data which is being transferred from client to server is very, very small. So thank you very much for coming today and for listening to me. We talked today about modern web standards. We looked a little bit at JavaScript libraries, and then finally we looked at building the Geek Quiz front-end application in Ember.js. I hope it gave you a good overview of what single-page applications are and how you can build modern web front ends for mobile and desktop today. It's it for another webinar. So we're now done with Tuesday 9th, and we're on to Wednesday 10th tomorrow with another webinar led by Martin Kern around API services for web and devices. It starts at 12:30, and of course we'll be running other sessions on Thursday, which is real-time communications with SignalR, and on Friday the 12th, running and maintaining sites in the real world. They're at 12:30 every day this week, and it's aka.ms/Azure websites training if you would like to register and attend any of those events. It leaves me to say thank you very much for joining me today on the call, and if you've got any questions at all, please just ask them in the Q&A system of the site, and I'll try and answer as many, or my partner Martin Kern will try and answer as many as we possibly can. My email address is martin.beebe@microsoft.com. Contact me if you have any feedback about the session. My website's thebeebs.co.uk, and on Twitter I'm at thebeebs. Please send us a tweet, say that you listened, and we'll see you next time tomorrow at 12:30. Speak to you soon.